Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Wolfenstein Youngblood for PC, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Switch. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and one of the follow-ups to Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. It was developed by Machine Games with assistance from Arcane Studios and published by Bethesda last week, and it generally got a pretty mixed reception on its launch, with the critic scores generally being a lot more forgiving than what the actual users were saying. So what exactly are we dealing with here, especially considering how much of a disaster Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus was? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. Well, as far as the presentation goes, it does run on the same engine as Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus did, which is id Tech 6, and it does have a lot of the same traits with a lot of asset reuse. That's not necessarily that much of a problem because the game generally does look quite good, although the character models are a bit off. But that just seems to be a bit of an issue with the textures and the shaders more than anything else. I'm not really sure what happened there, because everything else generally looks quite good with some very nice modeling and smooth animations, although some of the texture quality can be a bit iffy sometimes. And you do also have this really weird issue where the game just doesn't look like the time period it's trying to emulate. You see, the game takes place 20 years after the events of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, which means that it takes place right in the middle of the 80s. And the 80s had a pretty specific look. Now, obviously that's going to change a bit when you use the retro-futuristic art style and you throw in Nazi-occupied Europe and all that, but there's really nothing in this that really gives you that visual impression of the 80s. And they were clearly playing that up in the trailers leading up to the game, so that does end up being fairly disappointing when you really get down to it. But hey, at least the game is not simply brown and gray, there's actually quite a bit of color in it, so at least it's got that going for it. But then you move over into the sound design, and that's where things do get decidedly more 80s, because the soundtrack in this has a lot more of the synthesizer stuff that you would hear from the 80s, and they even have cheesy 80s style pop music that you hear on the radios in the game, so it ends up actually working out pretty well in that regard. And that vibe continues once you get into the sound effects, where the guns and explosion sounds are nice and beefy and punchy, although they don't really have quite the bass kick I'd really like out of them. So there is at least some room for improvement there, but generally speaking they've done very good things with the sound effects. And then you move over into the voice acting, and that's where things get a lot messier. Now, I will be fair to the actors. Most of the problems with the voice acting are not so much the actor's fault as they are the writing's fault, but they are still problems. I mean, a lot of the dialogue is absolutely cringe-inducing, and even aside from the cringe-inducing stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's just flat-out boring and lifeless, and then even on top of that, there's some that comes across as trying so hard to be cheesy that it just comes across as incredibly forced, and that just ends up not working out in the game's favor at all. But by far the worst part about the voice acting is all the cringe-inducing stuff, and that's what you're going to be hearing for almost the entirety of the game, because the twins never shut up. And their dialogue comes across as if it was written by somebody who has absolutely no idea what sibling relationships are like, or even just what normal people talk like. And so most of the time, their dialogue just comes across as incredibly cringe-inducing, and since they never shut up, you just have to deal with it the entire game. And that alone is almost enough to ruin the entirety of the sound design. I mean, if it weren't for the fact that the sound effects are as good as they are and that the music is as catchy as it can be, then the voice acting would just be that much more of a problem. But thankfully the rest of the sound design is able to compensate for that, and when you bring all of the presentation together, what you have on display here is generally quite solid. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set 20 years after the events of the New Colossus, where BJ and Anya have now had twin daughters, whom they've trained to defend themselves and ultimately become Nazi-killing badasses just like BJ and Anya were. At some point in the 20 years since New Colossus, America got liberated from Nazi control, and it has established itself as a power again, but of course the worldwide struggle against Nazi control does continue, and it's into this world that BJ just up and disappears at one point without a trace. Eventually some information comes back to Anya that BJ for some reason ended up going into Nazi-occupied France, and the twins decide to take it upon themselves to try to find him because they don't think the American authorities are going to do anything in Nazi-controlled France. So they end up taking a couple of power suits that Grace Walker's daughter Abby just happened to make, which is explained away as Set having worked with her to try to get those completed as kind of his last project, but let's be fair here. It's really nothing more than a pathetic plot contrivance to get the twins in power armor. Anyway, they take the suits of armor, they steal a helicopter, and they go over to Nazi-occupied France and link up with the French resistance, at which point they start a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back relationship with the French resistance in order to try to help liberate Paris, as well as just find out where BJ went, which they find out is some place called Lab X, and in order to get information on where Lab X is, they end up having to go to 3 towers, Brother 1, 2, and 3, and link up with the master computers there in order to download that particular data. But the leader of the French resistance is like, wait a minute, I don't think you're strong enough to take on Brother 1, 2, and 3 yet, so you should train up first. And that's ultimately where the narrative ends up falling apart, because up until that point you're like, okay, cool, we're going into Nazi-occupied France, we're going to liberate it, it's going to be more or less like with the previous game, but with some different mechanics that I'll talk about more in a moment. And then you get to that point, and instead of being the linear experience we were really expecting and actually hoping for, it openly rejects the design philosophy of the decent Wolfenstein: The New Order, and instead goes for a hopelessly generic hub world with hopelessly generic side missions that you have to go on in order to grind up levels in order to be able to take on the main missions. These side missions have absolutely no effect on the plot. In fact, the only change I noticed at all in anything from doing any of the side missions was that once I did the mission to take out the Nazi radio operator, the French resistance was the one doing the radio broadcasts from then on out, giving the people of Paris encouragement to fight against the Nazis instead. And I mean, sure, that's kinda neat, but that's literally the only effect that any of the side missions have on anything that's actually going on in the main story of the game, or even just going on in the hub world that you're wandering around in. This means it can be quite a while between actual story beats, and when you do finally get to those story beats, what you get is really just a pretty thin plot overall, with all the characters basically being one-note, one-dimensional, and completely uninteresting for the most part, although in the case of the twins, they can actively become annoying, because like I mentioned before, their dialogue is just very unnatural, does not sound like siblings really at all, and it ends up just being incredibly cringe-inducing for the most part, and even if you try to look at them as individual characters, that just doesn't end up working very well, because there's not really much character to speak of there. I mean, really the only thing you get from, say, the intro cutscenes to the game are that Jess is more of a huntress and Soph is more of a brawler, and that's kinda it. They more or less act the same throughout the entire game. Now you could say, oh, it's because they're twins, but that's not necessarily how twins are. I mean, I know several people who have twin siblings, and their personalities are almost nothing alike. I mean, sure, don't get me wrong, BJ's ramblings in Wolfenstein: The New Order and The New Colossus tended to be on the rather silly and ridiculous side, but at least he had a defined character. Here, they try to act like Jess and Soph have some kind of defined character, but they don't. They really just have a collective identity, which is a sure sign that the people writing this have absolutely no idea how both siblings and especially twins work. More importantly, the writing team just wasn't able to stick to one particular tone throughout the entirety of the story. I mean, at the beginning, it makes it out to be a relatively serious thing with some slight comedy thrown in, and then when you actually get into the game proper, it's mostly just all over the place. Sometimes there's serious moments that you can't possibly take seriously because everything that's going on is completely ridiculous. But then there are also moments like when you hop into an elevator to go to the next stage of, say, one of the brother towers, and they're basically pulling pranks on each other and that sort of thing. And yet other times it's going even further into comedy and basically turning the whole thing into some ridiculous slapstick adventure. It's like they don't really know what tone to take, so they take all of them, and it just ends up being a complete mess as a result. And then of course the way the game ends leaves it wide open for potential sequels, because of course they were going to make more Wolfenstein games. It's obvious. I mean, it's Wolfenstein. They're not going to let that series die, obviously. But it doesn't necessarily leave you wanting more from this particular storyline. It leaves you wanting other things that you just weren't given in this particular game. And this does ultimately lead me into talking about the gameplay, because a lot of that wanting more is simply due to the gameplay. You see, on paper, all of the gameplay elements you would think would be good in a Wolfenstein game are there. I mean, it has the same gunplay generally as Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, which, when that game did let you run around and shoot stuff, was actually enjoyable. You can play through the entire game in either single player or co-op, not just co-op, and you do have options for going into combat engagements, whether that be going sneaky or going in guns blazing, or just the variety of weapons you have access to, because you can carry all of your weapons except for heavy weapons at the beginning. You have to unlock an ability to carry those later on. And there are many, many multitudes of Nazis to stomp. Sounds fine so far, right? Well, here's the thing. When you actually go into the game proper, then it goes about like you would expect at the very beginning. You select which sibling you want to play, whether that be Jess or Soph. You select how your power armor looks, and you select your starting ability, whether that be Cloak or Charge. Now, Charge is like the ramshackles were in Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, where you would just be running and then just ram through enemies and just smash them to the ground and that sort of thing. And the Cloak is pretty much what you would expect. You can go invisible for a short period of time and then sneak around. And right from the get-go, you may notice an issue, and that is that even though I've already mentioned that Soph is more of a brawler and Jess is more of a huntress, you can select whatever abilities you want. If you want Jess to be more of a brawler and Soph to be more of a sneaky person, then, well, you can set them up that way, because they are completely interchangeable. They have access to all of the same abilities and all of the same upgrades, whether that be the weapon upgrades or the various abilities they can unlock over time. And while it certainly makes sense to give the player access to all of those abilities, it doesn't really make sense for the characters to have access to all of those abilities. What would make more sense is if the game design was more in line with what you saw from the opening cutscenes, where Jess is trained up to be more of a huntress, so give her the abilities that are more related to stealth and more related to taking enemies out from a distance, and then since Soph is shown to be more of a brawler, give her all of the abilities to get in really close and just wreck people's days with melee attacks and ramming through enemies in close quarters combat. But we don't get that. We get a uniform set of abilities between the twins. I guess maybe it was a bit too much to think that maybe there'd be a bit of asymmetry to the co-op, so okay, fine, we'll just set that aside. What about the way in which you actually learn these abilities? Do you just unlock them over time by simply playing the game and gradually learning new things? No, it wouldn't be that simple and straightforward and sensible. Instead, they decide to give the game a leveling system, which if you're used to most modern games like, say, the Far Cry series or something like that, you won't think will be much of an issue because, oh, well, it's a leveling system. Tons of games have leveling systems, except that it completely undermines the entire gameplay style of Wolfenstein. In order to make an experience point-based leveling system work, you have to put some degree of content into the game to allow you to gain experience points in order to level up. That doesn't sound like a problem until you realize that it just turns the entire design of Wolfenstein Youngblood into a generic hub shooter. You have a base of operations in the catacombs, and when you go to the catacombs, you will be able to gain access to various side missions that will allow you to gradually earn experience points and level up, as well as get currency that you can then spend on getting a bunch of other upgrades that I'll talk about in a moment. These missions are accompanied by a generic and frankly rather boring set of instructions and backstory as to why this needs to be done, and so you go and you do the thing, and then you come back to the catacombs, you turn in the quest, you get your reward, you get more quests, you go back into the hub world, you repeat the process over and over and over again, going through the same exact areas over and over and over again to accomplish missions in the same exact areas over and over and over again. It is mind-numbingly repetitive design. To make matters worse, whenever you leave an area, the enemies will end up respawning, so when you come back, you'll have that full contingent of enemies that you've already dealt with, only you probably have less resources available to you because you probably spent a lot of your ammunition, health, and armor already. This ends up making the hub encounters feel completely pointless, where you just go through, you clean out an area, then you come back to it and all the enemies have respawned. Well, why'd you even bother cleaning it out in the first place? If all the enemies are just gonna respawn anyway, then there's really no reason to bother cleaning out an area. You'd be better served either just sneaking through it or just straight up running straight through it and not wasting any of your ammo or to a lesser degree your health and armor, because you'll probably still be shot anyway. And you may say, oh, well, obviously because you want to get the the extra experience points from killing all those Nazis, and why wouldn't you? It's a Wolfenstein game. Obviously the gunplay is going to be a big draw of it, right? Well, you might think that until you actually get into a gunfight and realize exactly how the gunplay works. You see, it's very directly affected by the leveling system. Whenever you level up, you get a flat percentile bonus to your damage. So let's say you level up to level 2. Congratulations, you have an extra 2% overall damage. Okay, that seems a bit weird. And then you actually go up against enemies and you find that they have health bars. Now that's not necessarily a problem, that just gives you the information on how much health they have remaining, and that can be perfectly fine information, until you start noticing that you're really not doing a whole lot of damage to a particular enemy type. I wonder what's going on there. Well, it could be a couple of different reasons. The first being that you are using an ineffective weapon against that particular enemy's armor. You see, there are two different types of armor in this, depicted to the player as two different types of white pips on the side of the health bar that have to be depleted before you can actually start doing health damage. The ones that look like rectangular boxes with a dark filling in the center are one type of armor, and the ones that look like little white lines that are pointing vertically are the other kind of armor. And weapons that are effective against one type of armor are not going to be effective against the other kind of armor. So let's say you're using the Blazkowicz, which is what they renamed the submachine gun to because they put an actual machine pistol in the game and named it the Maschinenpistole, which is actually the German word for submachine gun, but anyway, that's beside the point. If you look down at the ammo count for it, you'll find that it has these small vertical lines on it. That means that it is effective against that type of armor. And if you use it against the guys who have the box armor with the dark filling in it, then it's just not going to be very effective against them, and they're going to be a complete bullet sponge. So obviously you're going to have to switch over to a different type of weapon if you don't just want to waste every last bit of your ammunition on that particular enemy. And that's where you find out that the types of damage that are done by these various weapons don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. I mean, you can infer from what enemy types you're facing what kind of armor you're dealing with. I mean, if it's the rectangular boxes with the dark filling, then it's going to be heavy armor because all the enemies that have that are well decked out in rather heavy plating, and if it's the small vertical pips, that's light armor. So you'll look at your arsenal and you'll think, okay, well, what would be more effective against lightly armored opponents than heavier armored opponents? Well, obviously something like a submachine gun, or maybe a machine pistol, or a shotgun, and sure, those all pan out just fine, but then you move over into the heavy armor and you're like, okay, well, what's going to be effective against heavy armor? Well, if you go by prior Wolfenstein games in the reboot series, then you'll know that lasers are particularly effective against them, so if you have one of those around, then you can use it, but most of the time you're probably going to be using the Sturmgewehr, which is kind of your go-to for heavily armored opponents, or even the pistol, because for some utterly baffling reason they decided to lump the basic semi-automatic pistol in with all of the weapons that are going to do extra damage against heavy armor. No idea why. It shoots a pistol caliber round. It's basically a 9mm handgun. Why the hell is it doing extra damage against heavy armor? That makes no sense. More importantly, why are the explosive weapons explicitly listed as being effective against light armor but not heavy armor? They should be effective against damn near anything. So it's bad enough that this system is in place, but it's compounded by the leveling system, because as you continue to level up, you'll find that the enemies are going to level with you, which means that they're going to get tougher and tougher. And on top of the enemies having levels of their own and there actually being level scaling in this, there's also the idea of enemy tiers, where when you go up in tier, you're much more likely to encounter enemies that have either more armor, if they already had armor to begin with, or if they didn't have armor, then they're just likely to happen to have armor in the first place. And those two things in concert, the leveling system with the tiering system, actually end up absolutely breaking any semblance of balance the game has, because even pretty early on into the game, you'll start running into areas where enemies have a red skull as their level, which means that their level is way higher than whatever you're at, and you're going to have to go back and find stuff to grind in order to level up so you can come back and actually kick that dude's ass. No, you're not mishearing me. I said you have to go and grind in order to level up so you can kick some Nazi's ass in a Wolfenstein game. And you may be thinking, well, screw that, I'm just going to run in and shoot the stuff anyway. And you will immediately regret that decision, because if you go in and you take on an enemy that has a red skull as its level, it will proceed to completely curb stomp you within about a second, because the amount of damage they do is just so high that you can't resist it, And even if you're using weapons that are supposed to be effective against their types of armor, you'll be shooting at them and noticing that you're doing almost no damage to them at all, and that's because, again, they're just higher level than you, they have way more health and armor than you are capable of dealing with, and the amount of damage you do is simply not enough. You have to grind in order to get those level boosts to your weapons, and you also have to grind in order to get kills with your weapons so you can get weapon proficiency levels, which will then give you additional damage bonuses with those specific weapons. Because, you know, this all makes sense in a Wolfenstein game. In case you can't tell, that was sarcasm. This does not belong in a Wolfenstein game. This belongs in the likes of, say, Destiny or The Division or something along those lines, which are looter shooters where you have the opportunity to gather gear and level up and that sort of thing, and they actually play to that strength in most regards. Instead, we get those style mechanics in Wolfenstein Youngblood, but the game design is really not built around it in the slightest, and it ends up being an absolutely tedious slog at best, and downright infuriating at absolute worst. I would like to bring your attention back to the moment a bit ago where I said that it's better to just run through a lot of the hub encounters or just sneak through the hub encounters so you don't waste any of your resources. That's why. The enemies are already bullet sponges to begin with, and if you're going up against enemies that are higher level than you, and you're dealing with the Red Skull enemies in some cases, then you're just going to be going up against enemies that take an absolutely ludicrous amount of punishment, and you're going to waste basically all of your ammunition trying to take down even one of them, let alone multiple. And again, the way the plot is structured, they explicitly tell you, hey, you're not ready to take on the main missions yet, you need to go and do side content until you're ready to take on the main missions, and that continues throughout the entire game. If you play the story missions before you're sufficiently leveled, you're going to be running into a lot of those enemies with the Red Skulls, and you're going to immediately regret every decision you've made up to that point, because you're going to be in a situation where you basically can't get out of it. You have to just power through it and hope that you have enough ammunition to survive. Oh, and here's a fun thing for you too. If you're thinking, oh, well, I just have a friend who is higher level than me, I'll just get them to power level me through it. They can't, because everything scales to individual player levels. So if you're going into a co-op match, and you've got somebody playing who's, let's say, level 30, and you're, say, level 20, then you're each going to see enemies that are scaled to your level. So if you're the level 20 guy, then you're going to be seeing enemies that are all basically level 20 or right around that, and that's not going to be the case for your co-op partner. When they are fighting the same exact enemies you are, they're going to look like they're higher level because they are scaled to their level. It is incredibly obnoxious. Of course, that's assuming you're actually able to get into the co-op in the first place, because I've been seeing numerous reports across a large number of players that are just not able to get into the co-op at all. And to make matters worse, it goes off of your Bethesda account, not your Steam account if you happen to have the Steam version, which means that if you go into your friends list to try to invite someone to your game, you're probably going to find that they're not there because it's not using your Steam account, it's using your Bethesda account, and your Bethesda account probably doesn't have that person on your friends list. So then you go and you try to find a way to add them to your friends list, which is way more complicated than it needs to be for the Bethesda launcher, because the Bethesda launcher does not actually have the friends list built into it. You have to go to their website in order to get that, so that is just plain obnoxious. And then you come to find out later on that it turns out that it's actually supposed to import your Steam friends list, but it doesn't actually do that unless your Steam profile is set to public, and I don't know anybody who does that, because why would you do that? You're going to set it to friends only most of the time anyway, so why would it be a problem if you're going to import your friends list if your Steam profile is set to friends only? It makes no sense. And of course, that problem is moot if you don't even have the Steam version in the first place, because if you get it from someplace like, say, Humble Bundle, then it's going to be a Bethesda launcher key, and you're going to have to activate it exclusively on the launcher, and it's going to exclusively use your Bethesda account. And then, even if you do have somebody in your friends list, there's a very good chance it's not going to actually connect to their game, and you're not going to be able to either host a game for them, or they're not going to be able to host a game for you to join, because for whatever baffling reason, it's just going to fail the connection every single time. And then you might be like, okay, well, I'll just play with a random person, and you'll hop into the quick match, which is the matchmaking. And then you'll find immediately that the quick match doesn't work either. It's going to say connecting for a while, and then it's going to throw an error saying something went wrong when trying to connect, and you're not going to be able to play co-op there either. Now, obviously, some people have been able to get into the co-op, and they're the ones who are like, oh, the game's a lot better when you play it in co-op. If you play it solo, of course it's gonna suck. Well, guess what? I tried to play it co-op. It will not let me play co-op. I can only play the game solo. And if you play through the game solo, it is a mind-numbingly tedious grind fest that is just incredibly irritating to play through. And I haven't even brought up the icing on the cake there. Because it's a co-op game, even if you're playing it solo, you cannot pause the game. You can go to the menu, of course, but it's not paused, so if there's an enemy there, then they're going to spot you and they're going to start shooting at you. You're going to take damage while you're in the menu messing around with something, and you may not even necessarily notice it until it's too late. And you know what? While we've added the icing on the cake, let's go ahead and add the sprinkles too. Because the AI, both friendly and enemy, is incredibly stupid. Enemies will mostly just kind of stand out in the open and let themselves be gunned down like it's nothing, and the friendly AI will just sit there and shoot at enemies and will constantly get spotted whenever you're trying to do stealth. And on top of all of that, then a lot of the time they'll just get stuck and not be able to come revive you if you get downed, and obviously that'll end up using some of your shared lives, which are another thing that's just annoying about the game. You have 3 shared lives between both sisters, and if you manage to go through the entire revivable phase without being revived and end up bleeding out, then you'll end up using up one of those shared lives, and if all 3 lives are depleted and one of you dies, then it's game over and you have to start at the last checkpoint. And you know what? Let's make the checkpoint system the cherry on top of this cake, because whenever you go into these particular missions and you say get to the final boss of that particular mission. So let's say you go through one of the brother raids and you end up fighting the big boss at the end of it, which is a particularly powerful bullet sponge of an enemy, and that manages to deplete all of your lives. Well, you go back to the last checkpoint and you'll think, oh, okay, well, I'll start at the start of the floor where the boss fight was, and then I'll just have to go from there. No. You start at the very beginning of that entire mission. Because apparently the only actual checkpoints are at the very beginning and very end of the level. And of course, because this is a co-op game, you can't save manually, because that would make too much sense. Now at this point, you're probably like, okay, come on DW, you've been ranting for a while now. There's clearly things this game has to do right, otherwise people wouldn't be enjoying it. Okay, let's play devil's advocate here. What does the game actually do right? Well, the level design is more open than what you saw in the previous several rebooted Wolfenstein games, which is, I guess, a decent thing, until you factor in the whole hub thing and the respawning enemies and the just incredibly tedious gunplay and the fact that so many of the environments are reused and things like that. But sure, the level design clearly inspired by Arcane but completely wasted on absolutely garbage game mechanics is definitely a feature of some description. Oh, and there's a pep mechanic where you can press the pep button in order to flash the sign of the horns or give a thumbs up, and that will give your teammates some additional armor or health depending on which one you've picked, and they can do the same for you, and it will also give you a small boost in health or armor based on which one you've picked. So, you know, that's a thing. Oh, and if you're one of those people who's really into collectibles, there's a bunch of cassette tapes and VHS tape covers and newspaper articles and such like that scattered around all the levels that you can find for a bit of extra experience points, and which will fill out your need for collectibles, if you even give a crap about that sort of thing at all. But no, I will be fair, there is exactly one mechanic that they did not completely foobar, and that is the weapon upgrade system, because with each one of your weapons you have a selection of different parts that you can attach to it to give it a different set of stat bonuses as well as some additional capabilities depending on which set you're working on. So you have 3 different sets. You have one that's centered around accuracy, one that's centered around rate of fire, and one that's centered around raw damage. And each of them have their own different stat bonuses and detriments that you have to keep in mind, and some of them even have additional special capabilities that will actually change the way the weapon functions in a fundamental way. Each of the parts you can pick also has an improved version that you unlock later on in the level progression that will also bump up those stat bonuses, and you can mix and match the parts to your heart's content, although you will also get a set bonus if you put 3 or more of the same track of parts on a particular weapon. And the way you unlock all of these weapon upgrades is with the silver coins that you will find scattered around the world and that you will earn by completing quests and killing Nazis and picking them up off of their corpses. And if it weren't for the level scaling completely ruining any semblance of joy you could have possibly had from the way the weapons upgrade and such, then that would actually not be the worst system around. And it also doesn't help that the silver coin hunting is very, very tedious and very, very grindy. So no, there is exactly nothing the game does that it actually does well. Every single thing goes back to that completely broken level scaling system that just ruins the entire experience and turns it into a tedious, grindy mess where you just don't want to engage in combat in a first-person shooter. And more importantly, you don't want to do it in a Wolfenstein game. That's not just awful, that's downright insulting. And to add insult to injury on top of that, they also put microtransactions into the game with the gold bar currency that you can use to buy purely cosmetic items. Now, admittedly, again, they're cosmetic only, but the fact that there are microtransactions in the game at all really does speak to a lot of their priorities there. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, the main effect of the very first patch of the game wasn't to fix any of the major glaring problems that I have mentioned already, but rather to remove the ability to use Cheat Engine to give yourself silver coins in a single player and co-op game. Because, you know, the game is clearly delicately balanced and you have to protect that delicate balance and make sure that the players are not trying to skip the grind in any conceivable way, right? Clearly, Machine Games and Bethesda Softworks have their priorities in order here, and those priorities have absolutely nothing to do with making Wolfenstein Youngblood an actually enjoyable experience in the slightest. Or really even a functioning one. And you know what the funny part is about all of this? If it weren't for the fact that the co-op itself is basically broken and the game is this much of a grind fest, it would at least not be quite as bad as Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. But as it stands, with this game being as much of a mess as it is, even if they did manage to fix the co-op, it would still be an absolutely terrible game that's really damn close to being as bad as The New Colossus. And ultimately, I just give it a 1 out of 5. It's an absolute disaster of a game that, frankly, I'm surprised is not worse than it actually is. I mean, at least the frame rates are solid and it only crashed one time in the entire time I was playing it, so at least there's that, but that's not saying much to begin with, and frankly, that's something we should expect from any developer anyway, so I'm not even going to give that to them. Thanks for watching.